Good afternoon. Welcome back to the Capri. My name is Tim Johnson, and with Caitlin Murray, I have organized this Agave Festival. Really appreciate you all being here. There's a great program of events throughout today, tomorrow, and Sunday. You can learn more at agavemarfa.com or on the paper program, which is available on the merch table on the way out. Archaeology is one of the sort of key components of the Agave Festival from its initiation point, largely because the inspiration for this festival was a film, Agave is Life, made by two people who work in archaeology and who are here in the front row, David Bryon and Meredith Dries. I watched this movie some years ago, and I just couldn't. It was I don't know what to say other than that it was a tremendous eye-opener. It was one of the things that helped me understand in a much more profound way where I lived. And in this fantastic movie, which I hope if you haven't seen, you will have a chance to see in the near future, there were a number of extraordinary people who appeared, and I thought to myself, I want to meet every single one of those people. And that's basically where the festival comes from. That and the fact that there was an agave lechuguilla in the backyard at Caitlin and my house, and trying to think about what that is and its history in human life and before humans and so forth. One of the incredible people that I know almost nothing still about archaeology, but I find it extraordinarily interesting as a frame. One of the cool things about Marfa, for me at least, is like we live with a kind of frame of contemporary art in the context of a geological frame and an astronomical frame. And in Texas, we live with a frame that's basically like the Republic of Texas forward. And so an archaeological or deeper historical lens on this place is really, I think, badly needed and is deeply refreshing for all of the difficult questions that it does raise about the nature of our culture as it is. It does open up new possibilities for understanding ourselves and our relationships to others. And in that spirit, I feel extraordinarily fortunate to have four of the just best or leading archaeologists who've been working on agave culture, either currently or in their lives at some point, here with us today. Their careers are, far more than I could sort of describe now, and I'm also not really qualified to do so. I am lucky that Steve Black, my friend who has also appeared at other agave festivals, is here, and he is going to introduce the event, and he will introduce the individual participants, and then each of them will sort of talk about their work and area of interest, and then we'll move four chairs out here in front of the screen and just have a conversation. So if there are any questions that arise for you during the individual presentation, just sort of mark them to one side, and we'll come back to them at the end of the individual presentation. So please join me in welcoming Steve Black.
Okay. Can you hear me now? All right. Very good. So, what we're going to do today is give you a few insights into the things that we've learned about agave and how agave was dealt with by the cultures that lived in the Chihuahuan Desert. Oops, if I can get my promoter to working. Let's just see here. There we go. I'm going to start it off. In the Chihuahuan Desert, I come at it from the east, from the Edwards Plateau and from the lower Pecos Canyon lands. All right, there we go. All right, anyway, I'm coming from the east in the Chihuahuan Desert, the far edge of it, the lower Pecos Canyon lands. My second presenter, Dr. Kevin Hanselka, also comes from that direction, but he has a specialty of archaeobotany. That means he's not only an archaeologist, but he's trained in botany. And what he does is he identifies and studies the plants from archaeological context. So he's going to help us a lot there. Kevin and I work together in the lower Pecos, among other things. Then we're going to turn to Dr. Bryon Schroeder, who's director of the Center for Big Bend Studies. And he and his team work right in the Big Bend, headquarters at Sul Ross University. And finally, but certainly not least, Myles Miller. He's the single individual that's put together more good data and understanding of the importance of agave in cultures of any of us. He works to the west in the Jornada Mogollon, on the other side of the Chihuahuan Desert. I gave a talk in 2017 at this, and it says 8 millennia of plant baking in the Lower Pecos Canyonlands. I will repeat almost none of that, and if I retitled it again, I'd add another 1,000 or 2 years. I also am the editor of TexasBeyondHistory.net, and we have an extensive set of exhibits on the Trans-Pecos Mountains and Basins. All right, so I've subtitled this The Chihuahuan Desert Mainstay, the mainstay being agave and how central it was to life in the Chihuahuan Desert. It's the largest desert in North America. You'll see it shown in different ways. One thing we're getting a better appreciation for is how long people have been here. Over 600 generations of people lived and thrived in the Chihuahuan Desert. It's an extraordinary time depth. Beginning at least 10,000 years ago, agave was an important part of that. And in my career, I focused on the mundane parts, food, and a little bit on fiber. You'll hear more than that today. It's not just agave, although this is Agave lechuguilla, the smallest and easternmost of the agave species. It's about this big. But it's not just agave, it's also related plants that are baked and processed in the same way, including Sotol, Docilarian, and on the right is yucca, as well as other plants that are related to it. And what unites them, in my mind anyway, is they were used for similar kinds of things. And if you bake them, it takes them 2 days to bake them. What you get out of it, if you scrape off the results, is more like a hockey puck. You could process it this way, and it's essentially a fiber sugar cake. You dry it and store it correctly. It'll keep for years, literally. The other thing that I know some about, and we've talked about and realized how important these plants are for fiber, and that's a sandal. That's a 3,000-year-old sandal from a cave to the east of here. So, I'll talk very briefly about how it is they process these things. They bake them. We find stone, what we archaeologists have called hearths. What they are is small ones like this, a big ones like this, and they're dish-shaped arrangements of formerly hot rocks. They're the heating elements of earth ovens, which I'll explain briefly in just a moment. We find lots and lots of them. In my career, early in my career, we didn't know what they were really. We knew they were cooking, but we didn't really understand what. Now we have a much better understanding of that. What we also see that are even more easy to spot are large concentrations of the spent cooking stones, burned rocks, firecracked rocks. They're sometimes known more accurately as mezcal pits. Here, that's not mezcal, the distilled liquor, that's mezcal, the baked agave. This, you can't really see it very well, but this guy is standing in the central pit, which is where the cooking was, and then the rocks would break apart, they would throw them out to the side. There's one in the Lower Pecos. They did it in front of a rock shelter, and it spilled all the way down. All that white stuff is firecracked rock. One of the reasons we know a lot about this is because the same processes are still used by living peoples today. And one of the ones that we know most about in the American Southwest are the Apache. These are fantastic pictures from Edward Curtis in 1907, and it shows harvesting agave. It shows that huge mound that woman, the matriarch who ran it, is an earth oven that's just been built. 2 days later, they come out and they pull out these amazing baked agave heads, hearts, and that's where the food comes from. That's where the fiber comes from, and perhaps other things as well. So, briefly, here's how to do an earth oven. You dig a pit 5-10 feet across. You add rocks, stones, and wood. You torch it and get it hot because you're heating up those rocks, and the rocks are going to hold heat for between 36 and 48 hours. So, you first have to add packing material, green material on top of the hot rocks, like grass or like prickly pear pads. That gives it moisture because moisture is critical. Then you put in our case, agave hearts. or soto hearts, trimmed. And you put them in there and you cover it with more of the green packing material, and then you seal it with a thick cap of earth. A small one is this big. A big one, like you saw with the Apache, is this big, and I'm going to show you a picture of one that's even larger. So that is known as the earth oven. And then 36 or 48 hours you come back and dig it up. And so what you find is this pit with rocks in it because they've taken the food out and processed and eaten them. These are shots of the Mescalero Apache who do agave bakes in Carlsbad every year. And it's not done as much for food today as it is ritual and cultural identity. Chihuahuan Desert peoples began processing agave over 10,000 years ago, and you'll hear some of the evidence for that as we go. You won't be able to tell what this is, but I'll just tell you anyway. These are radiocarbon dates. 9,000 years ago today, the white star means 2,000 years ago. And the point of that slide is that there's a tremendous increase in the amount of activity of plant baking after 2,000 years ago. The first one is Edwards Plateau to the east of here. This one is where Myles Miller works, Sacramento Mountains, just north of El Paso to the west. They show the same pattern. Great increase in the amount of production of these in the last 2,000 years. So why did this intensification occur? One of the areas that we know the most about it is during the about 600 to 800 years ago, when there were in these three areas. We are, let's see if I pointed us, Marfa is here. So at La Junta de los Rios, where the Rios Presidio, Texas, and Ojinaga, in the Jornada Magallon area, El Paso and beyond, and Casas Grandes. These three major centers, especially Jornada Magallon and Casas Grande, peoples were living, were farming peoples, but they also kept relying and using agave. Casas Grandes is the one that most of us know the less about, Pacame. And it was a huge center that had, at its height, that had 3- and 4-story pueblos made out of adobe, especially. They're famous for pottery. They've made a large number of pottery. This is Ramos Polychrome, traded very widely, including into the Big Bend. They also did things like raised macaw, scarlet macaws, tropical birds, and distributed them in the American Southwest. And this is the one that I'd like you to see better, but there were huge earth ovens, oven facilities. They call this the House of the Ovens. Here's was as it was excavated, and there's an individual in it. This is not one for excavating, not for cooking food for a family. This is a cooking food or cooking something for hundreds of people. I mentioned La Junta de los Rios, where the Rio Conchos comes into the Rio Grande, modern day Ojinaga and Presidio. Cabeza de Vaca came here in 1536. He had spent all his time on the Texas coast, barely survived. He was on his way to Mexico City. And he came to this place. He found a place that had what he considered real houses. They were made of stone and masonry. They were growing crops. He had spent all his time with hunter-gatherers. And so he found this extraordinary. La Junta, I like to call it the cultural crossroads of the Chihuahuan Desert. And there's lots of evidence for the movement of people, ideas, architecture, pottery, maybe agave, to and from this area. One of the individuals that was the most responsible for putting La Junta on the archaeological map was J. Charles Kelly, who grew up in the Big Bend, went to high school at Balmorhea, I think, and he worked here in the 1930s and the 1940s. Then he went off, became a famous professor at Southern Illinois University, studied further south in Mexico, Zacatecas and Durango. But he moved back here to Fort Davis in the late 1980s when he retired, and this is him at Presidio. This is early images of pictures. They did a lot of major work during the WPA era, putting people back to work, late 30s, early 1940s. And J. Charles, really the first archaeologist to start investigating and understanding these cultures, And one of his big strengths was that he knew a lot about a lot of different areas, and he worked a lot with the ethnohistoric records in early history that spoke of this place, La Junta de los Rios, named the people, talked about them, and he was the one that connected it to the archaeology. This you can't see very well, but what you're looking at is the foundations of a small surface pueblo. There's 5 or 6 rooms connected to one another, and it would have looked something like this. J. Charles saw this. He saw the parallels with the Jornada Mogollon, the El Paso area, and he thought there was people from the El Paso area that came down. The Jornada Mogollon came down and established La Junta. Probably not the way, but it was an idea. At one of the sites, at the same place where that little pueblo was, there's a large scatter of firecrack rock. It's part of one of those mezcal pits or baking areas. He called it a kitchen midden. Here's another site. It's called Loma Alta. It was probably the site that the Spanish named San Juan Evangelista in 1582. J. Charles excavated a series of these rooms that you see here. And he also, there we go. He put a trench through, but did not other report that I know of, a trench through one of these, what he called a mezcal pit. He knew what they were, but for him that was not the prime focus of his excavations, of his work. Late in life, in 1990, he began to better appreciate what these things were, and he said this: I believe that all of these La Junta phase sites on the lower Rio Conchos and the Rio Grande above the river junction were procurement stations producing a surplus of local plants, especially mezcal, meaning baked agave, and mesquite beans, and supplying the great redistribution center of Casas Grande, Pacame. Many of us think that this is probably not the case, that it was more for local production, but that idea is credible, and some of the evidence that Bryon and his team are coming up with causes us to think about this idea again and to want to think about it. So, I'll leave it at that. I will say that one of the reasons we're fascinated and learn about agave is because it was part of the cultural patterns in all of these areas. I'm not saying that agave is the main thing that linked the cultures together, but it helps us understand their relationships and the importance of it, the roles that this plant and related plants played in their lives. So, to better understand that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kevin Hanselka.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Black, for that kind introduction. Yes, my talk is pretty much divided into 2 sections. I'm going to start with just basic general plant use in the Texas borderlands as we understand them at a very basic level. And then I'm going to shift the conversation to be more focused on agave. But there we go. As Dr. Black suggested, aside from some later groups in the Jornada Mogollon and the La Junta district, parts of West Texas, for the most part, our prehistoric peoples in West Texas subsisted mainly by hunting and gathering. Although the Chihuahuan Desert at first glance appears very harsh and unforgiving, it actually has a whole lot of useful plants, not just to eat, but also for utilitarian needs. This list is not exhaustive by any means, but these are some of the major plants on the landscape in the West Texas borderlands in the Chihuahuan Desert that prehistoric people and traditional people today continue to use. For a hunter-gatherer, your camp locations and how often they are moved strongly depend on the spatial and seasonal distribution of plants like this. Apologize that's probably not very clear, but this will vary from region to region. For example, the lower Pecos Canyonlands to the east of here is a high plateau cut by narrow canyons. It's a shrub, short grass savanna. Say that 5 times fast. It has various trees growing in the canyon bottoms, riparian, like riverine resources growing along the major rivers like the Pecos and the Rio Grande. And there are numerous useful plants, cacti, grasses, shrubs, desert succulents that grow on the plateau above the uplands. However, these tend to be rather, to use a big word, homogeneously distributed. That means they're scattered kind of evenly across the landscape. So the best strategy for a hunter-gatherer in this kind of environment is to live in small groups, camp where the food is, and then move on when the food gets thin. So you move around a lot because the longer you stay in one place, the more the local food is depleted. As you move over into Trans-Pecos, Texas, where we are right now, Trans-Pecos is in the Basin and Range province. It has wide basins that are separated by long, generally north to south oriented mountain ranges. It also has large areas of evenly scattered plants like the wide desert basins or the Marfa Plain around here. These are occupied by typical Chihuahuan desert plants, but there is also a greater level of topography and extreme changes in elevation along the mountains. This topography supports multiple biotic zones. As you move up the mountainsides, you get into different plant assemblages. And with quick changes in elevation, those different kinds of plant assemblages are in close proximity to each other. So this greater diversity and what I like to call patchiness allows for longer stays in one place. Because if you strategically place your camp in one of these ecotones, an ecotone is an area where two biotic zones overlap, and there's a lot of diversity of plants in those zones. You can choose really ideal spots to camp and have access to a whole variety of resources. So different regions will have different kinds of strategies for dealing with what you want to eat or gather. However, we're not held at the whims of nature as much as this talk has suggested so far. There are ways we can enhance the productivity of the wild plants that we are trying to gather. Transplanting, sowing, tilling, tending, irrigation, fire. Use of fire is a really important tool. Just as an example, there's a recent book about the native use of plants in California, I believe. I think 4 pages of the index, 4 pages are related to fire. So certain groups just use fire because it gets rid of all the competition, allows weeds to grow, and a lot of those weeds are really useful. Transplanting, well, first I'll start with sowing. Sowing, it could be just like the casual dispersal of seeds across the landscape and as you're harvesting them to keep the population of that plant growing, or you can carry them away to a different location and start a new patch. Transplanting, which is going to be important in a few minutes, is moving a desired plant from one location to another for easier access or to give it a better habitat to improve its own life. Obviously, practices like this are really difficult to recognize in the archaeological record. Some of these practices will eventually lead to a domesticated plant. Like maize, beans, and squash probably started out by people doing certain things like this, but they were selecting certain qualities, and they eventually evolved to the point that they were completely different from what they were before. But often, these plants don't respond like that, depending on how much you're doing these kind of things. Wish this had come out clearer. These are a couple of examples of resource management. On the left there, I'm collecting wild tobacco that has taken over a recently burned patch of land. Actually, this is in southwestern Colorado. This was actually a natural fire, but it demonstrates how even a human-made fire would influence the plant life in it. On the right there, these are some friends of mine down in Tamaulipas, Mexico. They encountered a domesticated squash on a recently burned patch, and immediately they split it open and started casting seeds around, knowing that eventually they would come back and there may or may not be fruits there, but it wasn't going to be an issue if there wasn't. In West Texas, on the borderlands, there are a few good candidates for wild resource management like this. Prickly pear cactus is a prime example. Prickly pear was actually domesticated down in Mexico. We know that. But what's interesting is every one of those pads can become a new plant if it's dropped in an ideal spot. So in my mind, a hunter-gatherer who knows this would be dropping pads everywhere. Wild grasses. This is a plains. Where is it? This thing? Yeah. This is a plains bristlegrass inflorescence that was found in Hines Cave in the Lower Pecos. We know certain kinds of bristlegrass were very important to native groups down in Mexico. And in the Lower Pecos, if you examine enough human feces that is preserved in these caves, a lot of them are full of grass grains. So we know that. But we have ethnographic accounts of Native Americans in the West just tossing grass seeds out and just in the hopes that it's going to improve the patch. And finally, agave. And that's what I'm going to shift to now. Agave was domesticated down in ancient Mexico since at least 400 BC, and it was continuously cultivated all the way up to the Spanish conquest. Agaves reproduce by producing these tiny little, we call them pups. They're just clones of the major plant that come popping up around the side. And you can just pick those and put them in the ground somewhere and they'll become their own plant, basically a clone of the parent. And it's this ease of cultivation. Some people have claimed that early agriculture in Mexico was probably very highly dependent on agave because it was probably one of the very first plants to be cultivated like that. In certain parts of Mexico, where there's high risk of drought, a hardy, drought-tolerant plant like agave would be very important for when other crops fail. And some even suggest that incorporating agave cultivation into their economy basically made large settlements possible in arid parts of northern Mexico. In the U.S. Southwest, we've suspected for a long time that agave was brought under cultivation there too. And in the last few decades, evidence for that has been mounting. Classic period hohokam sites in southeastern Arizona, for example, many of these consist of fields of rock piles, these low piles of rock, and these fields are often full of roasting pits, like Dr. Black was describing. And often these sites are in low, dry places that the agave doesn't grow very well, naturally. These artificial rock piles were basically homes for transplanted agave. They functioned as mulch. When the rain comes down, the porous surface allows the water to penetrate the soil, and it keeps it from evaporating, so that's an ideal wet spot for agave plants in this otherwise inhospitable area. The roasting pits in these rock pile fields are they consistently contain agave, so we know that that's what they're roasting in them. And these fields also are scattered about the surface. They often contain artifacts that we associate with agave processing, like I'll show you a picture in a minute. We have these agave knives, these tabular stone cutting tools, scrapers that are used to remove the fiber from the leaves, and etc. Further, botanical work in the past 30 years or so has identified at least 6 likely new species of agave that are still surviving on and near hohokam sites. And they don't occur anywhere else. They're distinct from the surrounding population. We think that these are relic populations that these agave farmers were growing in these fields. A lot of this work, I need to give a shout out to Wendy Hodgson and Andrew Saliwan, who have done a lot of this recent great botanical work. I think I knew that. I wish I had been here for that. But yeah, okay, here's a couple of the archaeological signatures for this. The top is an example of an agave knife. It is basically a tabular piece of stone with a retouched edge. These artifacts like this and similar to them occur anywhere agave grows. The Lower Pecos is full of them. They're often very highly polished because the leaves are full of silica that polishes the stone. And they're ubiquitous. I was finding them in Tamaulipas and everywhere. The bottom is an excavated example of a rock pile. So they're just low mounds, but these fields are covered in these things. So what about the Chihuahuan Desert? Okay, I'm going to go off into speculation about a lot of this stuff. That these are just ideas, my own ideas. Well, mine and my colleagues, Leslie Bush and Phil Daring. In the Trans-Pecos, we recognize 5 agave species in the Trans-Pecos and adjacent areas. Of particular importance are these bottom 2. New Mexico agave, Agave Perii subspecies Neo-Mexicana, occurs in the very far western end of Texas around El Paso, especially further up north into New Mexico and the Sacramento foothills. But this plant is very important even today because the Mescalero Apache that Dr. Black mentioned still continuously harvest it and bake it as part of their ritual lives today. And then there's Agave Lechuguilla, common throughout the Chihuahuan Desert and further all the way to the eastern edge, as I'll talk about more. Both of these plants, they're not just food. Their leaves are full of fiber, so they're multi-use plants. Agave intensification. I'm going to specifically hone in on the lower Pecos Canyon lands because those rock shelters that Dr. Black mentioned, many of them, not just the shelters, but open sites as well, often they contain literally tons of burned rock. Evidence for literally thousands of earth oven firings and processing literally tons of agave and sotol. These plants are best collected and cooked when they are mature and ready to flower, which starts at about 10 years old. So therefore, not all plants on the landscape are ready for harvest and cooking at the same time. These earth oven cooking of all these plants would quickly deplete the natural stands of mature plants, requiring wider collection trips. To alleviate depletion, to make it to lessen it, it makes sense that hunter-gatherers would be trying to encourage new plant growth whenever they could. To me. As I said, the reproduction is mainly by producing pups along the base of the plants, so transplanting is a real big possibility, I would think. This is just an example. This is one of the big rock shelters in the lower Pecos Canyonlands. This is one where Dr. Black and I and the whole team have been working for a number of years. This is Eagle Cave. It's a gigantic shelter. You can't really tell in this light, but this talus slope in front of the cave is all burned rock. In this profile here that goes right down the middle of the shelter, this line that I'm pointing at right here, these are Paleo-Indian deposits dating back about 12,500 years. Everything above that, this is all ash and burned rock. I think there's about a dozen earth ovens in that profile, I think is what we found. So and this is just a slice down the center of the cave. I mean, on either side there may be dozens more, and there probably are. So this demonstrates the amount of lechuguilla that was being processed on these sites. Further, to give a further social dimension, we suspect that there were large seasonal gatherings of people. People were mostly living in mobile, small bands, but seasonally they probably aggregated in some of these big shelters for social events, for ritual. At that time, they were probably producing this wonderful rock art that it occurs in big murals in these shelters. And we suspect that these events were associated with big roasting events, not just roasting agave, but probably fermenting it as well, which I hope to hear about in a little bit. And this also highlights how the demand for agave would have probably depleted every agave plant in that surrounding area, requiring very careful planning for future events, very careful management. I would think so. Further, agave lechuguilla that grows in dry upland settings on the plateau is typically pretty stunted. This is a dry modern version, but none of these leaves are more than 10 inches or so. Plants collected and roasted from settings like this, the little heart that you're trying to get to is only about the size of your fist, and they taste very bitter when they're collected from these environments. However, we've observed multiple times naturally growing agave lechuguilla in settings that are comparable to those artificial rock piles that I mentioned earlier. This is again, hard to see the picture, but this is right outside the mouth of Eagle Cave on the canyon wall. There's some boulders that have fallen here. There's this trapping the moisture in there, and these leaves on this agave lechuguilla are twice as long as you find on the normal ones that you find on the landscape above. This is my good friend and colleague, Dr. Leslie Bush. Using her as scale, this is another setting on Shumla Ranch where it's an arroyo with boulders trapping moisture, and these plants are enormous. So my thought is you would benefit a lot from transplanting agave pups into these kinds of habitats. As I said, they're comparable to those artificial settings you see in Arizona. The plants respond very well to the sufficient moisture by producing longer leaves, and those leaves are good for fiber, right? So you'd want the long leaves as well. The higher sugar content in the heart makes them taste better. Dr. Phil Daring told me one time, and Dr. Phil Daring has created many earth ovens over the years experimentally, and he's roasted a lot of agave, and he says that consistently after a good rainy year, they taste far better than otherwise. So these are all advantages that I would think to want to transplant agave whenever you had the chance. This would help lessen the effects of over-harvesting, which clearly would have been a problem with so many agave lechuguilla plants being harvested and cooked. It would encourage lechuguilla patches closer to frequently revisited campsites, such as these major rock shelters. In planting them in ideal microhabitats, these high moisture environments would result in larger plants with longer leaves that are good for fiber, and tastier hearts for preparation in your earth ovens. The question is, how do we detect this? We're still working on that. This is hypothetical at this point, but because we don't, as far as I know, we have no recognizable artificial features comparable to those rock piles in Arizona. But we are playing with the prospects of measuring the leaf bases, the well-preserved leaf bases that we find in these shelters, to see if they consistently or statistically turn out to be larger than those that you would expect from drier environments. And I'm talking to some folks about possibly even doing genetic analyses that would help illuminate some of these issues. Thanks very much.
All right, our next speaker is the director of the Center for Big Bend Studies at Sul Ross University, Dr. Bryon Schroeder. He's only been the director for 3 years, but he's already accomplished a lot. He's really excellent at building up research teams and working in interesting places. And he's going to tell you a little bit about what he's learned relative to agave and the history of it in the Big Bend.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? I'm going to try to talk into this consistently. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what we know from the Big Bend region, and admittedly, we don't know as much as they do in the other subregions, and that's actually kind of an interesting topic that we'll talk about. And I think that's for a very specific reason. So you probably all know what these are. These are all different projectile points of different time periods, and in the Big Bend region, we have focused on these to basically exclude everything else. We don't know a whole lot about the foraging systems, but we know how to order time. Archaeologists really love these because they tell us time. And we can tell how old the site is with them. And we tend to get pretty myopically focused on them, to the exclusion of other stuff. So here we've done a really good job of studying these, and we've kind of missed the picture of what they're eating. What are people doing on the landscape? And I'm going to try to talk to you about how we're trying to rectify that right now, some ideas that I have about it, some of the findings, and you're welcome to critique anything and tell me if you think it's a good idea or not. So the idea of the evidence for roasting agave is actually really old in the Big Bend. It was first found at what's now called the J. Charles Kelly site. If you guys go up to Big Bend National Park and you park in the parking lot at the Chisos Lodge, one of the oldest earth ovens in North America is directly under your feet. Yeah. No. The article for it is in the Journal for Big Bend Studies. It was dug in 1992 and 1993. And for a while, this was the oldest evidence of presumably agave roasting. They didn't do all the really cool stuff that Kevin talked about, but we presume that they're roasting one of the plants that we're talking about that needs roasted in an oven. It's actually still there, too, so they only took a little piece of it. So the center for a long time, since about 2010, has been focused on some excavations on Terralingo Creek. And on Terralingo Creek, we have found consistent occupations that are old, and they're all earth ovens. I'm not going to talk about the Searcher and Juncture site. They're pretty contemporaneous with what's happening in the Chisos Basin. But I'll talk to you about the site called the GLD site. The GLD site was found in 2010. This arroyo actually didn't exist. And during one of our rainy seasons, this thing re-incised. And the two features you see here, we call them features. That's archaeology speak for ovens. There'll be ovens here. Those two things showed up. We got radiocarbon dates on them, which tells you when it tells you when the plant died, and you're basically dating when these things presumably were fired. Feature 1 happens to be currently the oldest earth oven in North America, and it's out here in the Big Bend region. So this is it exposed after we actually did an excavation. We're still doing excavation there now, and we have this evidence here. So I'm not saying that agave processing was developed here, but currently we have the oldest record. And I'll qualify that by saying something that Steve talked about. He talked about a lot of these were called hearths for a long time. I can almost guarantee that there's equally old ovens across North America, but archaeologists just haven't identified them as being ovens yet. So this story could absolutely change. But for the time being, the record of early oven use is out here in the Big Bend. I'm not going to get too in the weeds on this, but we've actually went back and we're digging this site again. We reopened it up, and one of the big things about processing agave is what is the environment like. I mean, if you're gonna process, it's got to be at desert conditions, right? I mean, that's what agave lives in. So we've been modeling the temperature out there. The yellow line is basically when those ovens are being used right here. This is when the ovens are being used at GLD, and everything left of this dashed line means basically cooler, wetter weather, and everything to the right of it is warmer weather. So what we found from doing works on these early ovens is that the initial use of them arises when conditions get more xeric. It starts to turn into a desert. So there could be, that could be something with why we're finding them out here right now. So there's an environmental context. We might not find anything earlier than that out here. So far from the GLD site, we have about 20 ovens that we've recorded. They're about 1.1 meters in diameter. They're something like that. They're not very big. These guys have all showed you ovens that are much, much bigger. And they seem to be what we call single use. They're not really using them that much. They have on an average about 141 to 47 stones. I will say this one that's got more stones in it is the latest one. So it seems by about 9,000 years ago, they're starting to make them bigger, and they're starting to use them more. And when you look at them, they're really neat. They're really old. They're pretty small. And I immediately thought, is it worth the caloric investment? That's how archaeologists think. If you're processing these things, have any of you ever tried to cut a sotol plant or pull a lechuguilla out of the ground? It's horrible. You have to put a lot of calories into it. They're super sharp. And you invest a lot of calories into this, and you got to make sure what you're getting back out is, worth it. And these just don't really look like they're worth it. So, and that's okay. I think that there's another way to think about them, and it preserves out here really well. It's the plant fiber. So maybe the initial context that these earth ovens arise in from the Big Bend is not so much for the food resource. They're not making those sweet cakes that Dr. Black was talking about. They're actually producing these fibers right here. This is raw fiber for almost everything in the toolkit. Almost everything that these folks use is raw fiber. It's just the actual insides of the agave leaf. I mean, it's the foundation. So that might schedule where you are on the landscape. If you're a hunter-gatherer moving around, your need to replace your perishable toolkit could be one of the reasons that you're moving around, and it might be the reasons that the ovens are so small, that you get a little bit of food, but you get the foundation for your technological kit that you absolutely need. Some folks, the Parsons have done some ethnoarchaeological studies with this for bigger agave than we're talking about. We're talking about Lechuguilla and Sotal. But the field camps for processing agave fiber, not for roasting it, but the field camps for just processing the fiber, are about the same size and look very consistent to what we're seeing in these old sites. I don't like projecting this stuff back into the past too far, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about. It's something to kind of way to think about it. So what they're doing with it, I'm going to just show you some of the technology they're making with it. This is a part of a net. These are all different various thicknesses of cordage, and a really famous archaeologist in the 40s came out to Coahuila and he dug, and he found this amazing ratio that I don't think archaeologists have truly really grappled with. So for every one of those projectile points in that slide that had all of the projectile points, he found that there are 20 perishable items. So we've focused so much on that stone part of the record, but we've completely ignored what is kind of the foundation for actually how they're moving around, what the technology that they're using. So I think that might be one of the original contexts that this oven use arises in. It's also how you move around. You're making your footwear out of this. There's not every part of a sandal goes into is not related to agave or yucca or sotal. This one is kind of funky. It's really small. This is a kid sandal, and it's made out of Lechuguilla, which is pretty funky. It actually came from Big Bend National Park. And the other thing that I think Myles is going to talk more about is kind of the social aspect of using the plant. These are scarifiers. These came out of a cave in Coahuila, and if I was to talk about anything they're used for, it would be totally speculation, but it's some kind of ritual. They're using them to bloodlet, is what a lot of archaeologists think. And then the other thing, we talk a lot about hunting, and obviously we focus on the projectile points, but the foreshafts, the finding, the entire spear system is made out of the stalks of agave. So the hunting system is actually built with the with agave as well. These are actually Sotal stalks, but the point is there. And this one is really old. This is actually from St. Esteban Rock Shelter. If anybody's going to come out there with us on Sunday, these are found together. This is the back half of a dart, and this is actually where the feathers would have went on. And if you don't know about it, it's an absolutely ingenious way to throw spears. And the part that we don't know about, so we know a lot about the early part where we know more. We're starting to know more about it. I won't say a lot. The part we don't know about is kind of the middle. The jargon we use is we call it the archaic period. But what it seems like in the archaic period, before it's preceding the period that Steve was talking about with Pacame and everything, is that earth ovens out here, just like in the lower Pecos, get large. They get really, really big. And it could be because of stabilized land use patterns. They could be coming back to these things and continually reusing these things. So there's a really interesting way to think about these things on the landscape, that they're coming back to them continually. These are parts of big seasonal rounds that we're admittedly at the beginning of understanding. This has absolutely nothing to do with agave, but at some point when you, at some point, what Kevin was talking about, when you start growing or you start propagating lechuguilla, like he's talking about, that is a way to get more out of the landscape. You have to, when your population grows, when that huge radiocarbon curve that Steve Black showed, presumably that's coeval with a large population rise. So as people get packed more and more on the landscape, you have to figure out creative ways to feed yourselves. And one of the ways is putting things in your diet that you usually don't eat. Here they might have promoted the growth of lechuguilla, but in the Big Bend, they don't seem to have done it as much. They started using corn. They started using corn really early in the Big Bend. About 2,100 years ago, they started incorporating this in. And Steve talked a little bit about some of the Spanish documents in La Junta, and I'll get there in a second, but a lot of the field thinks that as soon as you get corn, you get specialists, you get agriculturalists. You have people that are basically slowed down and they're all in on corn. We've done a whole lot of work on figuring out what people ate. What you eat is actually encoded in your bones, and we're not going to look at any of that. But the folks that are associated with that La Junta period, that period of Puebloan use, their diets don't look like they're eating maize at all. But we're finding a lot of maize out here. So it seems like they've broadened their diet out here. They've included things that they don't usually eat, but they're still, a lot of these diets are super consistent with still eating agave. So even though they broaden the diet and they include agave, or they include corn, they're still very much focused on these agave system, this agave resource. And that kind of gets me to this period. So Steve talked a little bit about the relationship with Pacame. It's always been kind of presumed out here. J. Charles Kelly came out and he did a lot of work. We find a lot of ceramics along the river corridor that are from this Pacame center, but nobody since the 40s has ever really hunkered down on these sites and really looked at this to see what this relationship is again. I can say that before I talk too much about this site, we have proven that there are groups of people that live here now and live in Pacame through genetics. So we know that genetically, people that are occupying here are also the same genetic folks that are on Pacame. So we've about the same time these sites start showing up, clearly people are here at both sites that are genetically related. This is a new site that we're going to test. We're going to go out there and do some work in the fall. And this is one of the big midden sites. This is all burned rock from earth ovens. That whole field is all nothing but burned rock. Everything out there, every little dot out there is rock from ovens. So this is one of the big midden sites that maybe J. Charles Kelly was talking about, that they're exporting the agave products to Pacame. But right now, all we know is that it's got Pacame pottery on it. It's got Jornada Mogollon pottery on it. What's interesting is we've done the geophysics, so we basically taken X-rays and looked through the earth to see where there was see where there was burning, and see where there was packed earth. And this giant midden has no burning in it. So we're super confident and optimistic that this thing is actually going to be a Puebloan structure of some sort. It might be a pit house. It might be something like Steve showed, but we're going to finally look into if the use of agave gets so intensified here that they can export it to Pacame. So where we are in the Big Bend is at about 10,800 years ago, we have the emergence of hot rock cooking here. We have the earliest example in North America currently. And we know that it seems like, about 800, 700 years ago, they're exporting mezcal on a level we presume they're exporting it to Pacame. But we have this big kind of open period that we need to do a whole lot more research in to understand how agave fits into this middle period of 8,000 years of human history out here. So that's kind of where we are now, and I'll hand it over.
I hope some of you are going to get to go see San Esteban Rock Shelter, where they're doing really fascinating research Sunday morning. and they're starting on excavations there Monday morning, returning to carry out new excavations there. All right, our final speaker is the one who's learned more about agave and archaeology than any of us, Myles Miller. And Myles has had the good opportunity to be able to work on Fort Bliss. And over the years, because the military has been trying to take care of its cultural resources, they've recovered a tremendous amount of information. And what Myles has done a spectacular job of is pulling together this information and explaining things that we'd never thought we could look at before. And he's going to focus on the social aspects of some of the data and information.
Can you hear? Okay. Not used to holding a microphone close. Well, thank you. This is really interesting, and as several people have mentioned, in the Southwest, I work in a Southwest culture area, the Jornada Magallon. It's kind of the unacknowledged stepchild of the Southwest, but it is a Southwestern culture region. And when you think of the Southwest, most of you think of corn and maize and Hopi, Navajo, the Zuni, and the great pueblos that depended on corn. But really on all the peripheral areas in the desert west, the southwest, and northern Chihuahua, northern Mexico, this long 10,000-year trajectory, really, corn is the exception. Agave is the constant for 10,000 years through even the historic period. And what I'm going to look at, one of the common themes I'm going to use here is the concept of feasting. And which one goes? There's feasting is a universal human activity, a universal human constant. It really didn't get too much attention until Bryon Hayden and some colleagues about 15, 20 years ago, but now there's a massive amount of research looking at this concept of feasting in archaeology and societies, because if you stop and just for a second, you stop to think, what social event in your life or all your friends and family's lives does not involve some sort of feast? Marriages, sometimes divorces probably also involve a feast, but holidays, religious events, all these things in our human interaction amongst our families and others and with other social groups involve some kind of a feast, including not just food, but alcohol. And part of what we had last night, a wonderful welcoming feast among several of the distillers here. We had a feast, alcohol, wonderful food, and everybody got together and there was social interaction. And this social interaction, it involves political dimensions in sometimes establishing and maintaining hierarchies and status. It involves social interaction in integrating or interacting or contacting various social groups. It also has economic dimensions in bringing in different people's massive amount of foods, quantities, excess, surplus amounts of food and drink and so forth into these contexts for feasting. So it has all these contexts that come together. And of course, the Romans, as we know, were some of the masters of feasting, the Bacchanalia and the Dionysian and Apollonian lifestyles. I mean, some of it is actually kind of rather gross what they did if you read with the vomitoriums and other things. But these guys knew how to feast, but there were very specific social and political dimensions involved in these feasts. And out in the Southwest, we can identify at least 4,000 archaeologically, and of course, probably much deeper. This is the Mescalero and the annual Mescalero Apache puberty ceremony, when several maidens of the tribe go through a several-day puberty and initiation ceremony. And one of the aspects of that is a large agave baking pit. All the community members dig a pit, they furnish it, they go out and harvest the agaves, and then they bake it, and then they distribute the agaves communally among the community. This agave baking that has gone on for thousands of years in the region is still today, in a couple of weeks in July, it will again be an integral part of community interaction, one of the major ceremonial events on the Mescalero Apache calendar. Then we can go back in the same region, just a few miles from the Apache reservation in the Sacramento Mountains of southern New Mexico, and here is a baking pit. You can't see the details, but it's about 1.5 meters high, about 12 meters diameter. We're looking at 115,000 cobbles weighing 63 or almost 64,000 pounds. And yes, my crew members, we dug trenches through these. They counted the rock and weighed the rock. They still hate me for doing that, but that's how we got quantitative data to look at changes in intensification through the years. But this one pit, 115,000 cobbles, 64,000 pounds of rock. And the interesting thing here is that when we look at intensively used fire-cracked rock from these pits, it's all broken from heat stress and it's all highly fractured. This rock had a exceptionally low amount or rate of fracturing. This is a giant feasting pit, probably used once or twice for bulk processing of agave back 4,000 years ago, when a bunch of hunter-gatherers met in this well-sheltered valley. And about half a kilometer from here is also a circular arrangement of rock with 4 hearths in the cardinal directions. There's probably a dancing circle or something that dates to the same time period. So you're seeing, even 4,000 years ago, with hunter and gatherers that you don't think are supposed to have ritual lives, which is a really dumb way to look at hunters and gatherers, that they had equally rich ritual and ceremonial and social lives during this time. Another example of a pit. Oh, well, okay, I didn't know I had animations in this. So there's the measurements. And here's an even larger pit for scale. There's my colleague Tim Graves. This one we estimate 200,000 cobbles weighing around 250 tons. So what we're looking at here, not just with feasting, but a massive amount of labor. My Apache colleagues told me they documented the person hours and the labor that went into making that agave pit for the puberty ceremony. Whoa! And it took 4 people, 7.5 days, 12 full-hour days to harvest the agave, get the wood, dig the pit, and fire all that. And that is also using modern trucks and modern tools and chainsaws and all these other modern implements. They did not have stone tools like they were using a long time ago. So, and then you get industrial level pits like at Casas Grandes, like Steve Black showed. And here's a modern mezcal pit in Oaxaca showing they're still baking these agave hearts and producing mezcal and things today. And it is very labor intensive. And one more example, prehistoric western Mexico. These beautiful ceramic vessels. Here's a guy with a tump line taking agave probably to one of the ceremonial villages. And here's a beautiful vessel shaped like agave that was probably used to, in a communal rite, to drink fermented mezcal. Because one of the aspects, we're going to look at the labor, because all of this work involves labor, and labor has specific issues involved. We know all of the feasts we make, Thanksgiving Day feast, you have to organize the labor. You have the old stereotype of all the men falling asleep watching football while the women cleaned all the dishes after the big feast. That doesn't happen at my house. But I help clean and wash. But, you know, all these things are dimensions, even arranging who's going to get the food, who's going to cook, clean, do all these things. All labor involves a political and a social dimension in organizing it. And an example of the amount of labor. This is one area in the Sacramento Mountains. One, that big pit I showed is somewhere down here. Somewhere down around here, but this is only a 10 by 14 square mile area. These are the archaeological sites we recorded during surveys. Here are 2 examples of those sites. These are virtual landscapes of agave baking pits, hundreds of them, 60 and 70. You're looking at 130 agave baking pits just in these 2 sites. So what we did, we took the number of agave pits, the number of sites, and what we knew was the average amount of burned rock transported into these pits, and we calculated that. So we have conservative, we estimate 7,800 baking pits are in that 10 by 14 mile area, which says 11 by 14 here. Just don't look at that. 77 millions, we estimated the average weight. So a conservative estimate is that 16 million cobbles weighing an estimated 20 million pounds of rock was gathered in just that one little area of the Sacramento Mountains. Now this covers about 8,000 years of prehistory, so it's spread out there, but still you're looking at an immense amount of labor. And this is also just for the rock. It does not include the amount of labor to harvest and process the agave into hearts, or the amount of labor to get all the wood, to dig the pits. We're talking serious labor dimensions, and that involves social, ritual, and political components. And one of that is they start bumping into each other. There's resource overuse. All of this, they have the commons, where everybody uses a common procurement area, but after some time, they're going to start overusing that, and that's going to bring in dimensions and conflicts. Now, what is one way to mediate conflicts? Again, going back using feasts and also fermentation. And one of the aspects that these agave pits we find are these flat stones. They're one of the major tools. They always seem to be overlooked. But we always find these flat stones, and these are pounding stones. They pounded the agave, and they also took out the fiber on them using those rasping tools, but also they pounded and squeezed the agave juice, the fermented juice out of it. When you bake the agave in long-term earth ovens, it breaks down the carbohydrates into sugars, and we can ferment sugars, and that's what we had last night, and we see testing Sotol and Mescal around here. They baked it and broken the sugars down and fermented it. So how did we get evidence of this? It's conjectural. Well, we know in the ceramic period, here's examples of Neolithic Balkan settlements where they fermented beer. Beer has been fermented for thousands of years. There's some ideas or theories that fermentation of beer was actually the impetus before the agricultural revolution. It wasn't to grow wheat and so forth to make bread. They grew wheat and grains and millet to ferment to make beer. So beer was why we're here and why we have civilization. So, but when you ferment beer, you get pits. It's acidic, and it creates etches and pits the interior fabric of the vessels where you're fermenting it. And here is a El Paso brownware shirt. El Paso brownware is the type of pottery near one of these burn rock midden or earth oven sites, and it's all covered in little pits. So they were probably using these vessels to ferment maybe corn beer, but also probably mezcal. So there's also an idea that the bedrock mortars, the holes in bedrock that we use, they think they used pestles to pound oak and mesquite seeds, but they may have also put liquid in there, and that's how they fermented it before they had ceramics. So with the labor and the ultimate, so to go back here, the ultimate reality of all this labor lies in the social component and social interaction of people doing it. And when you have social interaction, you develop rituals. And what we see is that these rituals become more complex, more common, they become more visible in the archaeological record. Even a famous anthropologist, Malinowski, when he studied the natives in the Trobriand Islands in the Pacific, he has a quote, "All economic activities have their magical components." And what he was referring to there, that all economies, everything has a magical or a ritual component. So we see with these earth ovens, they started putting the discard rocks when they pulled them out in the intracardinal directions. There's a lot of ethnographic work. The Mescalero Apache would lay out a cross of leaves when they put the foundational packing material in the cardinal directions. They would put, using cattail pollen ash, they would put a cross on the base of the first agave heart, and all of these things are centering their activities on the surrounding landscape, because southwestern societies center themselves in relation to cardinal directions and mountains and peaks. And so this is just one more aspect of them centering their activities and their sacred baking. And we see this even in the burn rock pits. And we also start seeing where they're leaving dedication objects. They sacred and leave some sort of object to animate or dedicate that baking pit. And here's a fossil. We find fossils all over in the Jornada in pueblos. They were used for medicine. They also relate to the watery underworld where the tribes emerged from, and so we find them in subfloor pits in pueblo rooms. So there's one they put right in the middle of a baking pit. And then we found quartz crystals. Here's a broken or terminated where they broke the turquoise pendant in half to deanimate it and put it in the pit, and then it's all burned. So we see this component of increased ritual behavior with the social behavior, all related to the labor investment of feasting. So one last thing, here's another aspect. There's a big baking pit in the middle of a plaza of a pueblo, and in the middle they put an infant burial and 2 turkeys in that central pit and covered it with a slab and also with white pure ash. So they dedicated this big feasting pit in the middle of a Pueblo room block with a infant, which is, that's a real dedication. And finally, to use a model and talk about ritual and all this agave and fermentation, going back to the Tarahumara in the Sierra Madre of northern Mexico. The Tarahumara referred to agave as the first plant God created, which shows the importance to them in subsistence, in ritual and social interaction. And they have something called the Tesquino network. Tesquino, usually people think it refers to corn beer, but it can also refer to fermented sotol and agave. And they have Tesquino, and the fermentation and distribution of it permeates every aspect of Tarahumara society. Every land exchange, every ritual, every marriage, everything they do involves a Tesquino ritual. And so they're moving this across the landscape. And this is a recent finding out in West Texas. On Fort Bliss, we do a very intense survey method where we look at every 15 by 15 meter square. We record all the artifacts in that square, and then we put all that information in a geographic information system program, and then across these large landscapes, sometimes 10, 20, 30 square kilometers of survey, we can query the GIS program and say, show us the ceramics. And when we started doing that, we found linear trails of ceramics going back and forth all across the basin. We've mapped 26 kilometers of these trails back and forth between pueblos. There's one of these little ones, you can barely see it. This little segment here actually goes to a large 100-room pueblo down here, and then it goes to the base of a sheer rock escarpment of the southern Sacramento Mountains, right below a ritual shrine cave that has pictographs. It has a seep in the back with a shrine in it, and it has ancestral pictograph imagery. It's a emergent shrine cave. So there you have a processional route straight from a pueblo to a shrine cave, but also we have all these trails moving across the basin, and they're probably moving turquoise, they're moving shell, they're moving other goods, but they're also undoubtedly, because there's so much ceramic breakage, they're moving fermented mezcal, fermented corn beer amongst themselves for these ceremonies. So that just gives you an idea that what we're doing here, this whole agave festival here, has to do with social and economic and ritual aspects of consumption of agave that we can now track back 10,000 years in the past. So I close with just a reading here that, again, going back to the issue of maize agriculture, that the focus, this goes to southwestern cultures. The relationship between agriculture and the evolution of social complexity has revealed only part of the picture in Jornada Magallon, economic, social, political, and ritual developments. The evolution of social complexity in the prehistoric Southwest is often framed in terms of agricultural production and its labor-intensive investments, leading to a variety of changes in economic, social, and ritual relations. But as we can see here in this study, the collection and processing of agavaceae and the fermentation of consumption of mezcal involved significant labor outlays too, involved a similar set of social arrangements to mediate conflicts over land, resources, and labor. So perhaps all these nondescript burn rock middens and earth ovens that people have kind of ignored and overlooked, they wanted to work on pueblos and beautiful Southwest ceramics, and they've ignored these for the past 50 years, but perhaps they offer another view of a pathway to the evolution of southern complexity in West Texas, around here, and in the Southwest. So, thank you.